Welcome to MAP, the bi-weekly market access podcast hosted by me, Dr. Stefan Walzer. I am the innovator of Market Access 4.0 and a health economist by training and working in the fields of market access, reimbursement, pricing, and health economics since 2004. Discover Market Access 4.0 and unveil the future with our innovative solutions. Max Insights, our fast and easy AI-based reimbursement planning platform. Dobo, our new revolutionizing way of creating reimbursement dossiers across the globe with the first and only dossier writing AI bot. Cubo, our new AI-based objection handling platform. And Waffle, train with Waffle's virtual reality genius in an immersive environment and with an AI-based counterpart. We are Market Access 4.0, so check out our website, marketaccess4-0.com. And now let's dive into the current discussions, processes, and trends in market access across the globe. So thanks a lot for accepting and welcome to the show, Mike Rosenblatt today. I think one of the big kind of pioneers, I would say, also in terms of medical affairs, but I would also say in general, even more, I think it's around medical affairs and commercialization, including, I would say, market access. But Mike, I think before we jump into a bit of the details of our discussion today, maybe you could introduce yourself as well.
Sure, I'm happy to, Stefan, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this podcast and our discussion. I'm honored, and I've really been looking forward to it. So I've spent about half of my career in academia and half in industry, in large pharma, biotech, and in venture. I've been the dean of a medical school, the president of a hospital. So I've seen the issues around drugs from the side of practitioners and the academic base. But I've been the chief medical officer at Merck. I've been the chief medical officer of Flagship Pioneering, which is a venture firm that created Moderna and was very involved in the vaccine effort. And now I'm a special advisor to a few life science funds and on boards and not-for-profits as well. So that's my career story, Stefan.
That sounds very impressive, Mike. So I think probably as well a lot of experience we could maybe as well share today. So I think the idea for today is really a bit to find kind of commonalities, maybe differences, maybe further touch points between, let's say, the two functions we are probably kind of representing, right? So the market access reimbursement area and you yourself basically coming out of the medical affairs area. But before maybe jumping into that kind of conversation, I think when I speak to some people, especially maybe call them a bit more specialists, right, in some areas, they sometimes even tend to say, look, I mean, clinical development and medical affairs are basically the same thing. How do you react to such a statement? I mean, there are significant differences, I would say.
Yeah, I think, of course, they're inextricably linked, but the functions are really quite different. And they, although there's some overlap in when they kind of dominate in the life cycle of a drug, they are a little bit separated from each other, with development, of course, coming earlier. So I think, both of them require their own special skill set. Mm-hmm. So someone who runs development or is good at development, they're thinking about the molecule or the potential new therapy that they've been given. And they need to be thinking ahead of how they can test it in patients and prove to the regulators and to the medical and to physicians and to payers what the value of this drug is, what it does and what it doesn't do, who it should be used in and who it shouldn't be used in, and kind of create a profile of the drug that really makes its features, good and bad, understandable. Yeah. The medical affairs people also have a special skill set, but it's not so much the design of clinical trials to satisfy these several constituencies. They need to be thinking about, once we have the information about this drug, let's just say drugs for now, although it's more broader, how can we need to be able to explain it to these various constituencies and to patients, by the way, although, you can't do that directly in many regions of the world. And some of their function is bidirectional. In other words, when you're going around and explaining, you don't just tell the story and deposit it with the listener. You have to be listening. And you have to receive information which you bring back to the company and often to your colleagues who might be designing the next clinical trial with this very same drug to show. So the medical affairs function is more interfacial, it's more public, and it has a much larger explaining and listening mode. And I would say also it is the principal interface with other physicians, which is a professional dialogue, doctor to doctor. And when it works well, it's based on trust. So the doctors out in the field say, well, I trust the information I get from this person. They're going to tell me the truth about this medicine, good or bad, whereas they may be hesitant to believe everything they hear from other sources.
Yeah, I know. I think that makes a lot of sense. Absolutely. And I think you explained already, I think that there might be different, let's say, focuses and different kind of, let's say, time points, where I think you said steps in the life cycle, where maybe one or the other function has a more prominent role, I would guess, right? I think, let's say in the earlier phase, it might be maybe really more development. Obviously, the more it might be advanced, it might maybe turn as well into medical affairs, where I would guess, I think medical affairs is then also obviously very much into the maybe kind of basis for all of the communication, also in the direction of the physician through marketing as well, right? But then also into the direction of the payers, right?
Yes, right. And by the way, from the beginning, they have to be in close communication with the developers. But the medical affairs, in my view, if they get too commercial or marketing, they can help those organizations. But their job, in my view, is to stick to the science and the medicine. And their voice will be strongest when they are expressing the scientific facts and the medical need. That should always be their foundation. So, they don't have to get into other aspects of what is important for marketing.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think you mentioned also, I think a couple of times now, it's basically really explaining, right? Explaining the product, explaining the value, maybe also call it a bit positioning in a positive sense, right? Not really only, let's say, from a marketing perspective, but maybe you can take there an example, right? I mean, if we think about, for example, the COVID-19 vaccination, right? A lot of people, but also a lot of payers have maybe not directly understood from the early beginning what the kind of final output, so the final value of the product might potentially have been. But the same, for example, also for ATMPs, right? For example, the first CAR T cell therapies, right? Where maybe the evidence base was even more weak than when you would compare it against the quite big COVID-19 trials. So I guess there's probably a very important then component, or maybe a good example here, where the market access functions and the medical affairs would need to really closely collaborate and try to explain then the value also in this way, not only, but also to the payers, right?
Yes, that's right. And by the way, that also applies. So what's happening now at an accelerated rate in a way that hadn't happened before, up until, let's say, about 10 years ago, there were only two therapeutic modalities. There were small molecules and there were biologicals, which included antibodies. For the first 50 years before that, there were only small molecules. And now, if you look in the last 10 years, we have all these new modalities, things that have never been on the planet before. Living cells as drugs, microbiome. What's the dose of a drug when it doubles in the body every 12 hours?
Exactly.
There's mRNA, which you just mentioned. There's gene editing, and so there are all these different modalities. So the in terms of explaining things, medical affairs not only has to say, well, here's a new agent for this disease. That's what you did when you had a small molecule. Now you have to say, well, look, this agent, it's very different. We put it in the body by IV infusion. It's going to multiply. The cells are going to divide. And well, these are very different things. And actually, we're in an unusual situation because when things were small molecules and you came to a regulator, whether it be US, Europe, Japan, or other regions, the regulator often knew much more about this kind of molecule than you did because they were seeing them from all the companies coming in. Now you come in with the first of a new modality, the little company or whoever has the new modality has knowledge base that even the regulators don't have yet.
Yeah.
So there's that doesn't fall to medical affairs so much, but still there's explaining just gets more and more important as we have these new therapeutic modalities.
Yeah, no, I agree. And maybe also it's probably kind of mixed for, let's say, for the follow-up kind of question. I mean, when I would be thinking about one of those kind of modalities, as you have just said, and, just imagine we're just taking one of these not yet available on the market, and the evidence base is, let's say, rather, maybe call it difficult from a payer's perspective, right? Sample size quite small, maybe just a single arm study, but payers basically believe in, let's say, the story, right? So, medical affairs, market access was able to convince the payer to say, yes, I would believe in that and I would be able to pay for it, right? But they would want to have a registry, for example, installed. Is that then rather a kind of as well work and responsibility of medical affairs and then obviously market access? Or is that rather something which you would say medical affairs may be part of it, but it's rather going to the development area because it's creating further kind of evidence? What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, Stefan. I'm not sure I really know the answer to it. I would say it probably varies from company to company and where the strengths are to do that. I think in general, I would put that with the clinical development group. And again, let the medical affairs people, let somebody else generate the data. And then the medical affairs group can take that data at their interfacial role with physicians and payers and others. So, but I don't think that's a hard rule. That's my inclination.
Yeah, I think that probably makes sense. Absolutely. But I think when having, let's say, a commercially successful product as a kind of end goal, right? Yes. When would you think medical affairs should be involved in the life cycle of a product?
Yeah, a good question. And for this one, I have a definite answer. Earlier.
That's true.
Earlier than you think.
Together with market access, I guess.
Yes, because I think for the most part, the larger, well-established pharmaceutical companies know this, that you have to tell the field what's coming. And you have to start telling them, 2 years or even more in advance. And if you look at the history of statins, first the medical field needed to understand cholesterol and the problems of cholesterol, and that set the stage for medical affairs. When I see now the last decade or so, I've been interacting with startups, and they tend not to think about medical affairs until much later, until almost launch. And that's a mistake because they lose the value at the launch. They lose the fast take-up because the field says, well, what is this new thing? We never heard of it before. Exactly. They should have been talking about it at at meetings of professional societies and specialty meetings for a couple of years. So that's why I wasn't trying to be a wise guy, but my answer is earlier. That's when you need to start.
That's a perfect answer. I will remember that when somebody's asking me when market access should be, let's say, part of the life cycle of a product. Absolutely.
Yes, exactly.
So, I mean, you also said obviously you have had different experiences for different types of product. Is there a difference in terms of, let's say, the responsibility, the tasks, but also the kind of involvement between, for example, drug maker, a company which is producing a medical device and or maybe a vaccine? Is that different, or is that generally, let's say, very, very similar?
Well, I think there are real differences. I think the way I would answer that would be to say, look, the foundation is the same. You're going to be talking about science. You're going to be talking about medical need in the profile of the drug. And you are going to be have integrity that the other side can feel. And as I said, medical affairs is bidirectional. Then you have to be listening and hear back from those people you're talking to what they see as the issues and whether you can address them, and bring some of those back to your colleagues in clinical development and the company in general. But once you're on that foundation, once you're on that platform, there are differences. I can't speak so much to devices because I don't have much firsthand experience. But if I look at the difference between drugs, which have been very involved in, and several that I've really helped take from the laboratory all the way to worldwide approvals. If I contrast that with vaccines, and I've been involved with a couple of them, including the Moderna coronavirus vaccine, the vaccines really have special issues. First of all, the scale. You're going to be giving it to a lot of people. Secondly, you're going to be giving it to healthy people. Thirdly, unfortunately, there is a political overtone now to the healthcare field, and at least in the U.S., the legal system and the justice system have become so involved in terms of, can you mandate the use of vaccines and where, in the workplace, or if you're a government employee versus a private employee. So there are many aspects. And often the vaccines are being paid for, or at least the COVID vaccine was paid for the patients, for the government, which isn't the case, at least in the US system, for many other drugs. So there's I would say there is a deserved specialty in vaccines. And it's interesting, Stefan, this field was kind of, it was atrophying. There was very little interest in vaccines. Several years ago, it was a backwater. People, big companies were losing interest, closing their vaccine divisions or selling them to others. Now, of course, it's extremely hot, and vaccines will do more than prevent an infection. They can be used to prevent cancers, and they are being tried to treat certain cancers. Mm-hmm. So it's a whole different field now.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I think that's already shown quite interesting and also quite important kind of differences. Maybe as well taking, I don't know whether it's step backwards, but just again, bringing in a bit the kind of two functions together, like medical affairs and market access. I mean, I personally had really very good experience, I think, in different, let's say, or with different kind of products, also with different kind of companies when working together with the medical affair functions. I mean, whether it was kind of simple joint advisory boards for, let's say, obviously with the payer view, but with a lot of physicians in there, or whether it was even, let's say, kind of the other way around, where we gave, for example, input and directions for real world evidence generation, right? But how would you see basically the way how those two functions should optimally work together? Maybe from a procedural perspective, maybe from a timing perspective, or maybe even from a content perspective? What is your experience?
Well, I think this is, I think, the most interesting part about medical affairs function, because they have these two big interfaces. One is with clinical development, passing the baton onto them, and then they have this interface with the marketing group and marketing access. They should be explaining not only the physician point of view, but in organizations that don't have a separate chief patient officer or patient view, they should be bringing the patient view and giving, in the same way that the clinical development group gives medical affairs the information it needs to tell its story. Medical affairs needs to give the market access group the information it needs to structure its initiatives. And I think that my own personal feeling is that there should be an element of advocacy, that the medical affairs group should be advocating for the field, the medical field, and the patients now, more and more, as I said, unless there's a separate structure. And I think that's helpful to market access to get it right. That's an expensive operation. There's a lot riding on it. There's the opportunity to get the medicines to the most people, hopefully all the people who need it. Medical affairs can be a very strong voice can't do it alone, at its interface with the market access group.
Exactly. No, I think very, very, very good points. Wrapping a bit up, I mean, you said obviously a lot of interesting and important components, but when I consider just the healthcare systems between, let's say, the various European countries and the US, but also in the global functions, right?
Yeah.
Are there key differences where you would say that's something really to consider, especially maybe even for smaller kind of companies, and maybe companies just currently growing, to consider, especially when installing maybe a medical affairs function?
Well, first, let me say, I have not recently had a lot of experience with regions other than the US, because the last several years I've been mostly involved with biotech companies and startup companies. They tend to focus on the US market at the start. And so I just want to be careful. It's possible I'll say things that are out of date. But I would say that in my past experience, the US is an extremely fragmented market. You have to interface with a lot of different payers, a lot of different physicians, but one thing that characterizes the US, in my view, is a hunger for innovation and an impatience to not get it. So, in the American system, if they know, and now everybody knows things because it's spread so quickly on the internet, the patient advocacy groups, everything. If you cured a mouse of cancer, believe me, there are going to be organizations that are knocking on your door. So that's whereas Europe and of course Americans are concerned with the cost, but not so much, not to the same degree as Europe. Europe, the economics of it are a much more important factor than in the US. And it seems, whether it's a product of the national health systems or it's the kind of temperament of society in Europe, they seem to be a bit more willing to wait for an innovation, see how it works, or see what the price is, or whatever the reasons are, the innovations tend to come a little later there because of the structure. And so I think that requires the cost business and the societal willingness to wait a little for innovation makes the medical affairs interface somewhat different.
No, I agree. I think the whole kind of, let's say, communication, as you said, I think the explanation, right, the speaking to it, and also probably explaining the value might be really the absolute difference. I think, as you said, I mean, if there's a big hunger for innovation, it's a different tone. Whereas if you basically speak to, maybe call it a bit more conservative kind of characters and systems, right? It's obviously, you could say it's a bit more difficult, but it's maybe also the way how you need to explain also how the product really finally works, right? I mean, we've just discussed about ATMPs in a broader sense. I think, as you have just said, none or most of those kind of new products have not been available so far. But if you compare it when those products were available, also obviously given the kind of quite high costs, right? The US was always first, I would say.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and the Americans always believe that the new thing, the next thing, is better than the old. It's not always true, but that's what they believe.
Yeah, no, fully agree. Very good. So coming to the end, if you would be able to give one advice, one key recommendation to a company, maybe just in an earlier kind of stage, right, preparing to commercialize a product, maybe take a drug, what would be your kind of recommendation to them with respect to medical affairs?
Well, it would. I don't know that I would have like one word. My keywords would be science. Stick to the science and the medical need, and don't be afraid to explain your product and justify why it's needed, what medical need it's. We saw this with rare disease. So science, medicine, and listen back. That would be my advice.
Oh, that's a very good one. I think I've not yet heard about listening, but I think it's a very, very good point for any kind of stakeholder. And obviously sticking to the science and the medical, I think that makes a lot of sense. So Mike,
maybe after our conversation, Stefan, I would add earlier.
Yeah, that's what I was expecting, firstly. But I think people who have listened to it, they will probably as well recognize it again. So start earlier than anybody else before. I think that's probably a very good advice, if it's the one thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Perfect. Mike, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thanks a lot for your insights. And talk and see you soon.
Yes, my pleasure. Thank you, Stefan. Yeah. Bye-bye.
So medical affairs is obviously a very important function within the kind of life cycle of a product. It's directly between a lot of different internal company stakeholders like development, like market access reimbursement, but also like, for example, marketing and a lot of further areas like communication, etc. I think medical affairs, as Mike has as well just said, is very much driven by science and the kind of head-to-head kind of conversation with the physician. So explaining the value, explaining the product. But I think what is also very important is what he said also towards the end of it, is really listening to what the other sides are saying. I think it's a lot of times what we have heard that, for example, in negotiation training, in communication training, etc. But ultimately it's listening, then also turning that back, right, into the strategy, into the tactics, into the direction of development, but obviously as well to, for example, commercialization and market access. I think the function is getting even more important now with the new kind of products, ATMPs and the like, where kind of mode of actions have never been seen before. So it might be very difficult to explain how those products not only work, but also which efficacy, effectiveness, but also safety profiles it might basically show in the future. So ultimately, and I think that's very important also keeping in mind, there are a lot of interrelations between medical affairs and market access. I think as already as well alluded within the discussion with Mike, I think it's not only the typical payer/medical advisory boards or the discussions with physicians in order to really prepare, for example, successfully for a submission, a dossier submission or a hearing, but it's also even more. I mean, sometimes it's simply really to explain to payers how a product works. Think about the various ATMPs and or also collaboration if, for example, a registry is finally needed. And finally, I would just simply agree with Mike. if you think about implementing the functions like medical affairs, but also like market access reimbursement, simply start early and probably earlier than what we see it currently in the market. That was an episode of MAP, the Market Access podcast provided by Mars Market Access and Pricing Strategy, which is your healthcare consultancy in the German-speaking markets. MAP is available every second week with a new episode, so watch out. And in case you might have questions, contact me directly and or visit our website on www.marketaccess-pricingstrategy.de.